Good morning to all of you. So thank you so much for joining us for this very interesting webinar on regulating the reuse and repurposing of oil and gas installations in the context of decommissioning. Our presenter today is Catherine Banet. Catherine Banet, she's Associate Professor at the University of Oslo, Faculty of Law, Scandinavian Institute of Maritime Law. In her research, Catherine focuses on energy, environmental law, competition law. She's giving lectures at international universities. She has written a number of books, studies, and articles. She's also academic research fellow at the Center of Regulation in Europe. As IOGP here in Brussels, so my name is Kamila Piotrowska, I'm with IOGP in Brussels. We met Catherine at one of the events at the European Parliament in Brussels, where she made a very interesting presentation on legal and policy frameworks for redesigning gas markets to fast-track pathways for clean hydrogen. And after several conversations with Catherine, we discovered that we've been working on a number of similar issues. So we thought that it would be useful, to bring the research and the industry and the policy together and have this exchange of views.
And thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today. Thank you. Thanks to the association. And this research that I'm going to present today has been conducted as part of the NCCS project, as you can see on this slide, which is a Norwegian CCS research center. And that means that as well, some of your companies may have supported financially this research, as you will see at the very end. And therefore, I use this template for this presentation, although I belong to the Faculty of Law, which is a partner to this project. So I hope this presentation will kick off the discussion, and with so competent attendees, your comments are very much welcome. Without further introduction, the points that I would like to cover today are the following ones. I will shortly elaborate on the drivers in reuse and repurposing. That might be different according to your countries and your companies. What is the practice and the different prospects, and that could also differ in the different countries and regions of the world. Then I will focus on the legal scrutiny and see if there is an incentive as today in the legislation, notably, or in the international and national, or if we should propose some further amendments to those legislation or contractual practices. I will focus on that, on the decision to decide on reuse, that's the process, but as well the decision in itself, and I will end with some recommendations. The background for this presentation is a paper that you have received in advance, so you can further read it afterwards, which is part of a book that we are about to publish on decommissioning, abandonment and reuse initiatives that covers different jurisdictions in the world and also has a common part, an international framework and contracts and HAC, etc. I will deal in that presentation with both reuse and repurposing because it's becoming quite hot topics for many of the decommissioning projects, and I will focus primarily on offshore projects. Reuse and repurposing is of increasing relevance, but at the same time, it will not be realized in all projects, and only a limited number of cases will in fact result in reuse and repurposing. This new focus is motivated by a series of factors, and I have identified three main ones. The first one is decommissioning optimization, where the actors aim to ensure cost efficiency through that opportunity of reuse and repurposing. Reducing decommissioning costs will benefit the licensees and the owners, but they also benefit the society as a whole because they reduce pressure on the taxpayers. The second factor identified is efficient management of energy projects by the prolongation of the lifetime of the former oil and gas assets. And those can serve new purposes such as, and I will name other purposes, but renewable energy generation or carbon capture and storage. So reusing those assets can help the prolongation then enable new projects, but can also reduce local opposition, because when you're developing new project, that's new infrastructure, and there is a general resistance even for renewable energy projects to develop new infrastructures. And even in the framework of reuse, we have seen that there is a local opposition, for example, onshore for the reuse of depleted oil and gas reservoirs for carbon capture and storage, or other type of storage like in the Netherlands at the Groningen field. So even for that, there could be some resistance. The reuse of oil and gas pipelines for transporting new gases seems to be better accepted. A third factor is in relation to the existing oil and gas infrastructures that can enable synergies. And offshore, we have maritime synergies across the sectors, and that will provide infrastructures which are already in place for energy system integration and the blue economy in general. Not least the current initiatives around sector integration and sector coupling, which has become the buzzword in Brussels, envisage reuse and of existing assets for new purposes. And that will also touch upon the deployment of hydrogen and biogas within their energy system, but as well carbon dioxide capture for storage. So in that sense, decommissioning is for sure a challenge, as many of you are working with, but as well an opportunity. Challenging because you have to ensure safe decommissioning, cost efficient decommissioning with different types of actors. But at the same time, it could be an opportunity, not least in the context of the decarbonization of the energy system and ensuring fair energy transition, because there are some workplaces that are involved, and that can contribute to something which is very core, and I'm working in Norway to the better resource management at different levels of the value chain. However, when we look at the regulatory framework for it, the reuse and decommissioning is not an obvious objective of decommissioning regulation. So reuse repurposing is not an objective of that in itself. And the purpose of that work has been to identify what are the incentives today, and are they sufficient? And if not, what can we change? What can we improve to further incentivize reuse and repurposing? The first element is in terms of practice and prospect has been to look at the hierarchy around the assessment of the different options. And it is a natural starting point because we're talking about decommissioning, and it's very close as well to the waste management hierarchy to look if those principles are already followed in the decommissioning legislation. So when we are talking about waste management legislation, we have the waste hierarchy, which is established and referred to in different pieces of legislation, which goes from prevention, reuse, recycling, recovery, and at the very end, disposal. And it's natural that the decommissioning of oil and gas assets also integrate that perspective, since it will be based on the waste legislation at the very end. So in the context of decommissioning, the following hierarchy can be identified, starting by prolongement of the installation, prolongement of the lifetime for the same use and same purpose. Then we move to reuse of the existing installations, fully or in part, with the same purpose, with or without relocation, and could be reused in another context even. but we keep the same purpose. Repurposing this time relies on reuse of installation, but for a different purpose than the original one. We have CCS, hydrogen production and transport, geothermal production, grid balancing, power to X, etc. Recycling of fixed petroleum installation is much strictly regulated in most oil and gas jurisdictions. And since the primary material for the petroleum installation for the base structure is steel, this is largely recyclable. And due to the expected oversupply on the rig market in relation to decommissioning, there will be a strong push in favor of recycling for the oldest rigs, at least. But still, when there are some materials that cannot be recycled, then they will be disposed according to strict environmental legislation. So the hierarchy that I just described tells that those alternatives should also be assessed in that order. And the hierarchy is already well enshrined in West legislation, if we compare to it, but it should, that's one of the conclusions, should appear more clearly in the assessment of decommissioning plans in national legislation and serve as a benchmark. It is done already in some jurisdiction, like in the UK, when there is a reference to the West hierarchy in the context of decommissioning, but it is argued that here that we could further expand that reference in decommissioning legislation. There are plenty of examples of reuse and repurposing in relation to the different elements of the installations. We have reuse of depleted oil and gas reservoirs for the purpose of CO2 storage, but as well reuse of installations or reservoirs for natural gas storage, as it is practiced in the US. And when it comes to CO2 storage, we have now a good experience and further projects supported by a permitting regime now in the North Sea, including in the Norwegian continental shelf. The reuse of wells is also an option, which is envisaged. There are some time aspect there as well, and location aspect. It should be the right location, and you have a quite tight window for reusing those installations for transport of other gases than original ones. Reuse of pipelines. Oil and gas pipelines can be reused and repurposed for transporting and storing even other gases such as CO2, hydrogen, biogases, or ammonia. So that's an option which is envisaged in many national plans and commercial projects. Also, we see that shipping is as well a flexible and sometimes cheaper transport option, which is integrated. Reuse of offshore platforms are also well investigated in different jurisdictions. They can serve as artificial reef. The platforms can be repurposed for new uses, such as injection of CO2 into depleted oil and gas fields, the conversion of the platform for energy generation, including for offshore wind, wave power generation, floating solar panels, geothermal energy production, power to gas, hydrogen production, and ammonia production. So we have a long list already envisaged options. There are more creative options that also have been developed, such as aquaculture hub, fishing opportunity activities, weather stations, research centers, even housing, hotels, or prisons. So we have plenty of creative options around the reuse and repurposing of offshore platforms. There are other installations as well, but they may be more challenging to reuse and repurpose and more costly. Now we move to the legal framework, legal regulatory framework. And the main question here is to know whether their decommissioning legal framework is providing sufficient incentives to promote reuse and repurposing. Starting by the international framework, the international regulation of on offshore decommissioning favors primarily complete removal or of fixed installations, and only as an exception allows partial removal or the reuse, repurposing if it's duly substantiated. We have some multilateral treaties in place, but they do not provide procedural rules either for assessing the pros and cons of reuse compared to full or partial removal. So that's another element, that we don't have assessing tools for making the decision. We have, however, some non-binding procedural rules developed by the International Maritime Organization in the form of guidelines, and I will come back to that. Regional treaties like OSPAR envisage reuse under strict conditions too, but this means that international law is recognizing the role of reuse, but is following a quite restrictive approach to it. It allows reuse under certain conditions, but it does not envisage strong incentives favoring it. So we may wonder whether there are stronger incentives at the national level. When we look at the national legislation, and I have focused on what I know the best, which is countries around the North Sea, we do find some references in to reuse in the decommissioning legislation, but in different ways. So I looked at first Norwegian legislation, the Dutch and the UK one. So I will elaborate on those three examples now. In Norway, the licenses will officially assess the different alternatives for the future operation of the installations when they prepare the decommissioning plan. The licensee have the obligation to submit the decommissioning plan to the Ministry of Petroleum and Energy before the production license expires or is surrendered, or the use of the facility terminated permanently. And they have an obligation to submit that decommissioning plan at least at the earliest 5 years, but at the latest 2 years prior to the time when the use of a facility is expected to be terminated. So it's fair window of 5 to 2 years to develop a project. There are as well some consultation procedures that are organized in the form of public consultations on the draft plans and the disposal decision, which can't enable third parties to come up as well with solutions. But it is not often the case, or very rarely the case, that such feedback is integrated into the final decision. So the ministry can also require and set as condition reuse options in a more discretionary manner. That's also a possibility. When we look at the Netherlands, and we have some experts from the Netherlands present today, so I'll let them elaborate further on that. But the timeline seems to me to be even tighter, with only a few weeks, 8 weeks prior to the plan removal date for offshore installation, to submit a removal plan to the competent authority. And then that window is quite short if you have to really take into account third parties' ideas. That means as well that the decision in itself and the possibility to integrate reuse option primarily lies between the hands of the operator, and it will be too late to integrate new possibilities. When we look at the UK, the Petroleum Act also requires the submission for approval of a decommissioning program. It is based on a request, this time from the authorities, from the Secretary of State, that will serve a notice requiring the submission of the detailed decommissioning program. What is interesting is that the decommissioning program must demonstrate that the potential for reuse has been examined and discussed with the Oil and Gas Authority. So there is an incentive and a requirement to discuss reuse options. So when we look at those three jurisdictions, there are some incentives, although they differ, and there are different timings for submitting the decommissioning plans. But there are some elements that could be further used and developed. However, based on the review we have done in the book, there are very few jurisdictions that have defined reuse option, the assessment of reuse options in their decommissioning legislation. So it may appear that countries around the North Sea are a bit advanced in that respect. The legislation, in conclusion, does not yet contain very detailed or detailed enough provisions and so incentives to consider reuse at an early stage and in sufficient time to consult widely to develop innovative reuse and repurposing projects. And again, the timing aspect is crucial. It is crucial to realize the project and to as well secure the different elements of financing, and before that research and innovation, financing, but as well permitting, which takes time. And some studies in the UK have shown that you have actually a quite tight window in the next coming years to develop CCS projects before the installations will disappear because of decommissioning. And then there is a period of roughly 10 years between the decommissioning of a natural gas platform and its recommissioning for CCS. So that's the window identified in those research, UK and the Netherlands. The timing aspect raises as well a series of legal and financial questions. And I'm questioning first whether we should develop legal and financial incentives to support keeping assets that could serve repurposing objectives such as CCS, wind, hydrogen. And that will require not only to oblige the licensees and the owners to leave the installation in place and monitor them, but also to provide for financial compensation for it. So we can be creative. We can imagine a fund system for ensuring that those installations remain in place and compensate the licensees and owners, or a system for suspending the assets for a period of certain period, like it is envisaged in the UK for 10 years, and after that period, the decommissioning regime will apply at full. So that demonstrates that there is a need for more coordinated and holistic approach to reuse as part of decommissioning legislation, such as the three main proposals that I put on this slide. The first one is a need for national strategy for reuse, which includes both the planning of the reuse, that it is a strategy around the planning of the reuse, and the planning of integration of the different within the energy system, so energy system integration aspect. Several governments have started mapping oil and gas infrastructure that have reuse potential for notably CCS, CCUS, offshore wind and hydrogen, such as in the Netherlands and the UK. And they both have published assessment reports or national strategies on the topic. It is important in terms of planning as well that there is a coordination exercise which is done to ensure a minimum of coordination between the different processes. So this is a strong call for having more coordination in the planning as well. Planning processes could be better integrated among the sectors in that when we think about sector integration and energy system integration, there is a need to coordinate those processes. And to do so, the reuse perspective needs to be clearly mentioned as an assessment criteria, not only in the decommissioning legislation, but also in the energy planning legislation. The second element of a more coordinated and holistic approach is establishing a meeting platform for actors interested in reuse. And this has been done in different countries. I identified two strong initiatives. One of them is represented today with the Next Step platform for decommissioning in the Netherlands. And the other one is Decom North Sea, DNS. So providing either on a non-for-profit basis or as piloted by industries or governments, a hub, a platform for actors to meet and discuss early the possibilities of reuse and repurposing when decommissioning projects are coming up. And that could also include a local population to get them on board and reduce risk of opposition. There could be the basis for developing standard agreements that can be used by those actors. The third element of that approach is the need for a regional strategy on decommissioning and reuse, because we need to coordinate those initiatives. The energy system are more and more coordinated, and we need to make the most of the infrastructures in place. So regional coordination is both necessary, but sometimes is also required in the legislation. We have some infrastructures, some initiatives in place. For example, in North Sea, we have the North Seas Energy Cooperation. We have coordination within NTSOE and TSOG. So there are different initiatives that could be used. In terms of requirements of consultation between different countries, we have incentives under OSPAR and the ESPO Convention to consult the neighboring countries when cross-boundary projects are developed or when there is a project nearing the border. And that could be an opportunity as well to integrate reuse for them as well. So in terms of spatial planning in the North Sea, there are some obligations that must be taken into account, and not least under the Directive on Framework for Maritime Spatial Planning. Something that will become as well, will arrive on the agenda, and I'm still at the European level, is legislative initiatives for a reinforced coordination of energy project development under the European Green Deal. The European Commission has announced that they will propose a strategy on offshore wind, and as well the revision of the legislation of maritime spatial planning. So we may see here or have the opportunity to argue for better integration of reuse of existing infrastructures, also in the context of the trans-European energy infrastructures. The countries around the North Sea again have announced that they will coordinate their national energy and climate plans and integrate the different projects that can be cross-boundary. So that's something that also is in the making. Move to the decision in itself. And I'm looking first at the process for making the decision before moving to the decision itself. Because the process for making the reuse decision is not always straightforward, would it be for the licensees or for the authorities. And in addition, there is no identified experience with legislative framework or regulation which provides for guidance on the list of the different considerations that should be taken into account. Those central considerations, and again, it's both for the licensees, the owners, but as well for the public authorities when they have to assess the reuse option, are primarily the technical feasibility of the reuse project, the economic consideration, is the project of reuse viable both for the former owners and the new owners, if there are different ones, but as well the legal framework for reuse, because sometimes we may not have sufficient legislation in place to ensure that there is clarity during that transfer of assets in terms of decommissioning liability. So that's important elements that should be better covered. We also need a case-by-case decision. This is quite obvious, and it has been said by the different national authorities. There is no one solution fit it all. It should be a case-by-case approach. However, I argue that some common guidance in the form of a list of public assessment criteria and some prioritization principle could help standardize the current practice and could as well help ensuring more transparency and certainty in the decision-making process. Because if those criteria that public authorities will rely on for reaching a decision on reuse, if there is a proper decision, that could also provide certainty for the licensees and operators and new owners when they are putting forward their proposal and developing the new project. There are some consultancies that have elaborated tools, decision matrix, based on those different considerations. So this is something which is done for private sector, and you may yourself have been using those tools. Some of them have also led to more specific programs, and we have people from California and around the Gulf of Mexico. There are as well some good examples of rigs to reefs program that have been based on a series of assessment criteria. So there are some practice that could be further used and expanded. If we move to the next step and say, what kind of decision do we have? Once we have taken that decision, we have indeed no administrative reuse decision. And one question that I raise is whether we need such an administrative reuse decision and what will be the advantage of having such a reuse decision. In practice, the decision to enable reuse is usually not embodied in a final decision, although it has been encouraged if we read the guidelines from the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, to have more legal certainty around that decision. So the IMO has formulated recommendations, notably that the coastal state with jurisdiction over the installation or structure provides for, and I'm quoting, a specific official authorization identifying the conditions under which an installation or structure or parts thereof will be allowed to remain on the seabed. The IMO guidelines also recommend that the coastal state has in place a clear legal framework ensuring clarity concerning the ownership of the installation and structures which remain in place, and the responsibility for maintenance and the financial ability of the owners to assume liability for future damages. So we find some incentives under those guidelines. They are non-binding, it's soft law, but we find incentives there. Having an administrative decision on reuse could also provide a clearer legal framework and better foresee the new legal situation which is created through a reuse project. This legal certainty may also enable the actors to make a decision quicker. It could be, if not defined in legislation, it could be based at least at a minimum on some contractual arrangement and standardized agreement between the parties. That brings us to the question of what could be the terms of such decision, of such agreements, if it's not in an administrative decision. Among the essential terms and conditions that need to be determined are the transfer of ownership in the assets, the transition from a petroleum exploitation license to another license for reuse project, because it will be another legal regime, legal permitting regime, the type of liability for the reused assets in case of damage or injury, and the transfer of decommissioning liability from former to new licensees and owners. And we may also consider the completion of international consultation and approval processes as part of that decision too. There are aspects of liability, as I mentioned, which are crucial. They can serve both and foremost as sometimes a barrier to the development of reuse projects, because there is uncertainty around that liability regime, both for the reused assets. It's they are reused, so they may have been facing harsh weather, and therefore one should be careful when assessing the safety aspect of it. But as well, liability questions related to final decommissioning. And that's another liability regime which needs attention, and that the reuse infrastructure will need again to meet at the end of its lifetime after the reuse project. Many national petroleum laws provide for a system in addition of secondary liability of former licenses in relation to decommissioning, and that could prevent some of the actors, because there are uncertainty around the reuse project and maybe new owners, new operators, that may prevent them to engage and to into a reuse project, and therefore some opportunities may be tapped. So rethinking the regime of liability for final decommissioning and a secondary liability regime is something which is key to incentivize as well reuse. We have seen that in the UK, the government has been proposing last year to introduce a provision on the removal of the decommissioning liability for the secondary liability when the assets are to be transferred for CCUS projects. So this is something which is considered. The same, I believe, in the Netherlands, where the government has made proposals to incentivize reuse projects by clarifying the transfer of liability for final decommissioning. So consistency is needed on the liability aspect, but as well to within the new permitting regime, and to have a clear transfer of liability and responsibilities, and to clarify the requirements under the former regime of petroleum exploitation and the new regime for the reuse. So in conclusion, I made some recommendations based on the different arguments I have developed now. The first one is that the authorities should better enshrine the West hierarchy principles in their decommissioning legislation, with reference to notably the circular economy principles, which are again going to be very high on the agenda of the European Green Deal in the European context. Should also be developed a consistent and holistic approach. Governments should elaborate national strategies on decommissioning and reuse in close interaction with the development of low carbon energy system. We should aim to ensure that energy system integration, which includes reuse and of oil and gas installation, is planned at national and regional levels. So this is a call for better planning and integration of reuse and repurposing into planning. Should establish as well meeting platforms, meeting places for actors interested in decommissioning and reuse project, as we have seen in some countries. The government should as well better develop guidance in the form of a list of public assessment criteria for assessing the reuse solutions to be used as part of the draft of the decommissioning plan. They should also provide, if so needed, financial incentives or compensation to keep the installations in place. Fund system could be elaborated, or temporary decommissioning of disused facilities. The government should as well, and regulatory authorities, consider the need for a separate administrative reuse decision, should define in law, or at least through standard agreements, mandatory terms that a reuse decision or agreement should cover. And finally, provide incentives for reuse by amending the liability regime for final decommissioning, in particular the secondary liability regime applicable to former licenses. With that was the last point of my presentation, and I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your comments and remarks.